My daughter-in-law embarrassed me in front of my own family. She smirked. She belittled me. She tried to paint me as a bitter old woman desperate for relevance. She thought she had cornered me, humiliated me, destroyed whatever respect I had left in my home. But she didn't know I had one question waiting for her. One question that would make her hands shake and her voice dissolve to nothing. But to understand how we reached that moment, I need to take you back 5 hours before the explosion. It was a Saturday, the kind that should have been peaceful. My family was gathering for dinner, something we hadn't done in months. I cleaned the house, cooked dishes they loved, and set the table with plates I only brought out for special occasions. I thought everyone would walk in smiling, grateful, warm. But the first to arrive was my son, and his wife shadowing behind him like a queen arriving to her throne room. She didn't smile at me. She didn't hug me. She gave me a look, the kind that evaluates, judges, ranks you lower. I brushed it off. Maybe she was tired. Maybe I was overthinking. I tried offering her tea, but she waved a hand dismissively, as if I was a server interrupting her. My son barely noticed. He was glued to his phone, nodding absent-mindedly when I asked how work was. I swallowed the sting. Then my daughter arrived, then grandkids, then cousins, laughter filling the air. But underneath it all was something sharp, something tense. My daughter-in-law watched everything, where people sat, who talked to whom, whose attention I got. She didn't like it. She had always been subtle about it, making comments wrapped in sugar, disguised as jokes, but carrying venom. "Mom forgets things now," she'd say lightly, when I merely paused to think. "Let me handle that. It's too complicated for her," she'd laugh in front of others. I ignored those things before, choosing peace over pride. But that day, she wanted war. It began small. At the dinner table, I commented about a recipe my grandmother used. My daughter-in-law cut in. "Oh, but times were different back then. Women didn't have much to do besides cook." Everyone laughed lightly. I smiled, pretending it didn't cut. Later, I said something about my granddaughter's school achievements, and she snapped. "Well, education is different now. It requires modern parenting, not outdated thinking." My daughter glanced at me, uncomfortable. Everyone sensed the disrespect. But my son stayed quiet. That hurt more than her words. Still, I told myself, let it go. But she wasn't finished. We moved to the living room. People chatted about work, relationships, the world. I told a small story, something from years ago, a lesson about family loyalty. She interrupted me again. "Oh, please. You always dramatize everything. You act like you're the only one who ever sacrificed or raised children." Silence fell. She smirked, proud of herself. My cheeks burned. My heart pounded. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, she added, "You know what? You just really hate when someone else has influence or a voice. You want to be the queen forever." People shifted in discomfort. My daughter stared at her, shocked. My nieces looked awkward. My cousins exchanged glances. I saw my son's head lower, but still he said nothing. I stood there, feeling stripped, exposed in the home I built. She wasn't done. She leaned back on the sofa, crossed her arms, and declared, "Honestly, you create problems because you can't stand that I have a relationship with your son. You want him all to yourself, but you should accept you're not the center anymore." The room stiffened. Somebody coughed. Someone whispered my name, but my daughter-in-law was triumphant, like she had slain a dragon. I excused myself politely and walked to the kitchen. My hands trembled, but not because of sadness. Something inside me clicked.
5 hours earlier, I woke up excited, preparing to host my family. I thought this day would be a memory of joy, but now it would become something else entirely, a confrontation long overdue. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the teapot. Her voice echoed in my head, mocking, claiming power. She thought I was weak. She thought age equals silence. But she didn't know I had something she never expected, the truth. A truth I had held for months. I didn't want to use it. I tried to protect my son, tried to keep peace, tried to respect her, but she forced my hand. I heard movement behind me. My daughter walked in, touched my shoulder. "Mom, you don't deserve this," she whispered. "Say something." I nodded. I walked back into the living room, calmly. Everyone looked at me. My daughter-in-law lifted her chin, smug, assuming I would either cry or apologize. Instead, I sat in my chair, folded my hands, and asked casually, "Should we continue this conversation honestly?" She scoffed. "Please, I'm always honest." "Oh," I said gently, "so you wouldn't mind if I ask you something in front of everyone?" Her smirk faltered, just slightly. "Sure," she said, pretending confidence. "Ask." I leaned forward, voice steady. "Do you want me to tell them, or will you answer yourself?" Her eyes flickered. She didn't know yet what was coming, but her instincts warned her. The room leaned in. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth to say something, but the words never came. I smiled softly.
That's when her face drained of color. She shifted, her hands fidgeted. Everyone held their breath, because the question I asked her next would shatter the image she carefully built and expose the secret she had desperately hoped no one would ever bring up. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on us. My daughter-in-law, Alicia, had no idea what was coming, but instinctively, she felt something had shifted. Her confident mask wavered ever so slightly, and yet she fought to hold on to it. Daniel sat frozen beside her, the tension in his shoulders betraying his own confusion. He loved his wife, but he had never seen this side of her, the one that thrived on humiliation and subtle domination. My own children looked between us, sensing the storm without knowing its origin. Everyone in that room was holding their breath, waiting for the next move, because they knew when I chose to speak, it was never just words. It carried weight, history, and the authority of someone who had seen it all. I took a deep breath and let my gaze drift slowly over her, letting her realize she was the focus of the room in a way she never intended. Alicia crossed her legs, tapping her foot impatiently, clearly unsettled by the silence. She tried to speak, but I held up a finger, not aggressively, but in that calm, controlled way that communicates without words that this is no longer a game. I felt my pulse quicken, not with fear, but with a surge of clarity. Months of subtle insults, whispered criticisms, and carefully hidden slights had been stored inside me like a reservoir of patience and dignity, and now they would surface, not with rage, but with precision. There is a power in calmness, I reminded myself, one she had never learned to respect. I glanced at Daniel, hoping he would finally understand, but his eyes were still clouded with hesitation. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that this wasn't about humiliation or vengeance. It was about exposing the truth. He needed to see in this one evening what had been happening quietly for months under his nose. And as my gaze returned to Alicia, I could see the flicker of doubt growing in her expression. She was beginning to feel the tension she had created all along. The room, once filled with the soft hum of casual chatter, now felt compressed, charged with electricity, as though every second stretched and thickened the air. Every person present sensed the approach of confrontation, though they could not predict its shape. I decided to let the suspense build, letting her imagination work against her. I started recounting small moments, carefully chosen incidents from the past few months, without anger, without accusation, but with meticulous clarity. I described the dinners where she had made cutting comments, the times she subtly belittled my efforts in front of Daniel, even the little gestures she thought I hadn't noticed, the eye rolls, the sighs of impatience, the condescending tones. My voice remained calm, measured, almost serene, but every word landed with undeniable force. I watched as her fingers twitched against the armrest of the sofa, her perfectly manicured nails tapping an erratic rhythm that betrayed her anxiety. She realized she could no longer hide behind polite smiles or dismissive gestures. Every act of disregard she had performed was now being observed and documented silently for the entire family to witness. As I continued, I noticed my children's faces, a mix of disbelief and anger, reflecting what I had endured in silence. My daughter's jaw tightened as she processed each revelation. My grandchildren, oblivious to the intricate power play, but sensing unease, shifted nervously. Daniel finally spoke, a low, questioning tone that carried the weight of years of denial. He asked, "Mom, are you serious?" I didn't answer him directly. I let the narrative continue, letting the tension unfold naturally, like a slow crescendo in a symphony, building until every note, every subtle inflection, drove her further into discomfort. Alicia tried to interject, offering half-hearted explanations, excuses thin as air. I didn't mean it that way," she started, but her voice faltered under the weight of truth. She couldn't finish. Each sentence I had crafted, each detail I had chosen, left her without recourse. She realized that what I was saying couldn't be argued away, that her facade of control was slipping faster than she had anticipated. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, as though the very atmosphere had become suffocating. Every person in the room felt it, the quiet power shifting, the subtle yet undeniable authority leaning toward me. She had never faced resistance like this, especially not in public, and certainly not with the family observing in quiet solidarity. I paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch between us. It was a deliberate move, one designed to let the gravity of my words sink in. She shifted uncomfortably, adjusting her posture, flicking her hair as though to distract herself from the sting of exposure. My eyes never left hers. In that moment, I realized that the slow, methodical unfolding of tension was far more effective than any immediate confrontation could have been. It was not just the words, it was the timing, the calm delivery, the way every detail landed precisely where it needed to. The quiet authority of someone who had endured and observed every slight, every hidden job, and had finally decided that enough was enough. Then I began to steer the conversation toward the single question I had been preparing for weeks. I didn't announce it. I simply guided the discussion with subtle prompts, mentioning facts that would eventually converge at the point of revelation. Her eyes flickered repeatedly, trying to read my intentions, trying to anticipate the angle of attack. But she couldn't. She had underestimated my patience, my strategic silence. Her smirk was gone now, replaced by a faint tightening of lips, a subconscious sign of unease.
I felt the tension in her shoulders, the quickening pulse behind her collarbone, and the slight tremor in her hands as she clasped them in her lap. The family sensed the shift, too. They leaned forward ever so slightly, curious, waiting for the inevitable. I described a particular dinner 6 months ago where she had made a pointed remark about my hosting skills. I recounted the way she had dismissed my effort in front of Daniel, the way she had laughed when I tried to correct her misstatement. My voice remained steady, almost soft, but the implication was undeniable. Every small detail of her disrespect was brought to light, and she realized with growing horror that the room was fully aligned against her narrative. My son's brow furrowed, my daughter's eyes widened, and even the youngest members of the family felt the weight of her unraveling composure. She was trapped, not by anger, but by the undeniable force of truth.
I could feel the careful control Alicia had always wielded beginning to crack. The poised, unshakable facade she wore so easily in public was now trembling. I recalled every subtle jab, every condescending remark she had thrown my way over the past months, and each one now reinforced the inevitability of what was about to happen. I described them softly, methodically, never yelling, never raising my voice, but letting the precise sequence of events unfold. She had thought her actions were invisible, but every glance, every sigh, every silent judgment had been observed, cataloged in my mind, ready to be laid bare. I watched her shift in her seat, the fingers of one hand curling tightly into a fist, then unclenching, then curling again. The tension had become almost unbearable, a tangible presence in the room. My son's eyes were fixed on hers, a mixture of concern, guilt, and bewilderment flashing across his face. He had defended her in small ways for months, ignoring the subtle cruelty because he could not reconcile the woman he loved with the acts I had described. But tonight he was forced to witness the impact firsthand. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply let the stories breathe, letting the narrative of her behavior speak louder than any argument could. The weight of each truth landed squarely on her conscience. Even as she fought to maintain composure, her posture stiffened, her hands now resting tightly on her lap, and I could see her calculating, trying to decide which lies or excuses could salvage her image. There were none. I shifted slightly in my chair, keeping my voice measured, calm, almost deceptively gentle. "You see," I said, "these are the moments I remember. These are the nights I held my tongue to keep peace, hoping respect would eventually come naturally. But respect is not given when it is ignored, nor is it earned by undermining those who have always been here for you." I let my eyes meet hers fully, unflinching, unrelenting. The room held its collective breath. Every subtle movement she made, the way her eyes flicked toward Daniel, the way her hands twisted in her lap, was a signal that she understood the gravity of what was being communicated. I was no longer just recounting events. I was demonstrating that the power she thought she had wielded was an illusion when I had quietly dismantled. Alicia's attempts at response were weak and faltering. She tried to inject humor, a feeble laugh, a dismissive wave, anything to reclaim the narrative. "Mom, it's not like that," she started, her voice slightly quivering despite her effort to sound confident. But every word stumbled over the room's silence. There was no laughter to mask her guilt, no smirk to protect her ego. Even Daniel, who had tried to excuse her behavior in the past, could no longer deny the truth of what I was laying out. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly, as though physically aligning himself with the truth he had avoided for so long. My children's expressions were a mixture of shock, pity, and restrained anger, reinforcing the subtle but unyielding pressure that had built around Alicia like a tightening noose. I let the tension linger, allowing the room to absorb the implications fully. Every detail I shared had a purpose, each revelation adding to the undeniable momentum. She was cornered, but she didn't yet fully understand the consequences. Her breaths came faster, though she tried to mask them with the mechanical calm of a practiced socialite. I could see the tremor in her hands now, the faint quiver as she clasped them tightly together, the slight sheen of perspiration forming at her temples. The once confident figure of dominance was shrinking under the weight of truth, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, not of malice, but of justice. She had assumed she could manipulate perception, but she had failed, and tonight the room itself bore witness. I paused, letting the silence stretch long enough to let her anxiety peak. Every subtle movement she made was now amplified. A flick of the eyes, a nervous swallow, a shift in posture. I knew that by allowing her to anticipate the question, to feel the inevitability of the moment, the impact would be multiplied. Months of hidden humiliation, subtle control, and emotional manipulation had all led to this point. I leaned slightly forward, keeping my voice soft yet unmistakably clear, and said, "There is one thing that has been on my mind for months, something I've wanted to ask directly, but I waited for the right moment." I could see her pulse quicken, the way her chest rose and fell unevenly. She knew somewhere deep inside that this was it, the pivot upon which everything could change. The family watched silently, everyone sensing the tension without needing to speak. My son's hands tightened on the table, his face pale with realization. My daughter's eyes never left mine, a quiet support that bolstered my own resolve. Even the younger ones sensed the electricity, the almost tangible weight pressing down on the room. Alicia shifted in her seat, glancing toward Daniel, then back at me, her mind racing for a path that no longer existed. Her defenses, meticulously constructed over months, were crumbling faster than she could repair them. She had underestimated me, underestimated the quiet power of someone who had endured, observed, and patiently waited for the moment of reckoning. I drew in a slow breath, savoring the pause. "I need to ask you," I said calmly, each word deliberate, "a question that has been on my mind since the first time I noticed the pattern." Her eyes widened slightly. Her fingers fidgeted once, twice, then folded tightly in her lap. She wanted to appear composed, but the tension betrayed her. Everyone in the room leaned forward, subtle but undeniable, drawn into the gravity of what was about to be asked. She had dominated these dinners, these moments for months, thinking herself untouchable. She did not yet realize that this question would shift everything, that her carefully constructed image was about to be exposed and dismantled in front of the very family she thought she controlled. The anticipation was unbearable. I could feel it radiating from her, from my son, from the others seated quietly around the table. Every subtle movement, every twitch, every involuntary blink told me that the tension had reached its peak. The room was a delicate web of attention, expectation, and suspense, and each strand was anchored in that one looming question. I smiled faintly, not out of cruelty, but of certainty. She had assumed dominance, but now she was entirely vulnerable. And when I finally asked it, when the words left my lips, the room would shift irreversibly, and the consequences would unfold in real time with witnesses who had long since grown tired of silent complicity. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves were pressing in, tightening around Alicia. She sat rigid, a perfectly straight line of posture that belied chaos in her mind. Her eyes darted around, scanning faces, searching for support, for escape, for even the smallest sign that she wasn't completely exposed. But the family sat silent, watching. They had already sensed the pattern, the subtle manipulations, the quiet venom she had draped over our gatherings like a shadow. And now, that shadow had nowhere to hide. The air was thick with anticipation, each heartbeat hammering like a drum in the silence, each second stretching longer, heavier, more impossible to bear. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing on me too, but in a different way. This was not fear. This was clarity, the power of truth ready to be spoken aloud. I leaned slightly forward in my chair, letting my hands rest on the table, steadying myself. My voice, when it came, was soft, almost conversational, but it carried the precision of someone who had rehearsed every word in her mind for months. "Alicia," I said, allowing the sound of her name to hang in the air, a small weight in itself. "There is something I've been meaning to ask you for a long time." I let a pause stretch, watching as her eyes flickered, her fingers fidgeted ever so slightly against the fabric of her dress. She tried to mask her rising anxiety with a faint smile, a slight lift of the chin, but I saw it, every imperfection betraying her composure. Even Daniel shifted in his seat, sensing that the moment had arrived, that the balance of power had quietly, irreversibly begun to tilt. I continued, carefully, deliberately, describing one more small incident from a past dinner. I recalled the way she had belittled my choice of tablecloth, the faint but cutting remark about my cooking, the subtle tone in which she had dismissed my efforts as outdated or unnecessary. I didn't raise my voice, didn't add any dramatics. I merely recounted, with clarity and calm, the undeniable truth of what had happened. Her hands twitched, her lips pressed into a thin, straight line, and for the first time, I saw her uncertainty pierce the confident mask she had worn so easily for months. My son's jaw tightened as he processed the sequence of events, realizing perhaps, for the first time, that he had not seen the full weight of her disrespect. My daughter's eyes were wide, shining with a mixture of disbelief and support, silently urging me onward, ready to witness the confrontation unfold. It was time for Alicia to answer for her actions. Alicia attempted to interject, a faint, strained protest escaping her lips. "Mom, she started, but the words stumbled and died in the heavy silence. She tried again, but her voice faltered, betraying the panic she could not yet fully articulate. She realized that the room had turned against her, not through anger, but through the undeniable force of truth. Every family member present was quietly observing, their expressions reflecting comprehension, acknowledgement, and a silent solidarity. She had misjudged the power of patience, the quiet authority of someone who endured disrespect in silence, only to wait for the perfect moment to respond. And now, that moment was here. I shifted slightly, letting my gaze sweep the room, drawing in the collective attention, letting everyone feel the gravity of what was about to happen. "I've asked questions before," I said softly, questions that she ignored, questions that were dismissed. Tonight, I am asking one that will require honesty, not excuses, not laughter, honesty. The words were simple, calm, yet they carried the weight of months of observation and restraint. Alicia's eyes widened, a flicker of panic passing over her face. She could no longer rely on charm or subtle manipulation. The tools she had wielded effortlessly were useless against the quiet precision of truth, poised to strike. I paused deliberately, letting the air thicken, letting the anticipation crawl through the room like an invisible current. Each family member's attention sharpened, leaning in subconsciously, aware that something pivotal was approaching. Daniel's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white, his own inner struggle apparent in the tension of his shoulders. My daughter's fingers tapped lightly against the table, signaling both anxiety and readiness, while my grandchildren remained quietly attentive, sensing the serious weight of the moment, even if they did not understand the details. The atmosphere had transformed from casual dinner to a charged, delicate standoff where every word, every breath carried potential impact. I drew in another measured breath,
and finally leaned forward, letting my calmness amplify the tension. "Alicia," I said slowly, letting my voice linger on her name, "do you understand the impact of your actions over the past months?" Her face betrayed a flicker of defiance, a reflexive attempt to reclaim authority. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, the faint quiver in her tone betraying her bravado. I could see the cracks forming in her perfect veneer, a subtle twitch in her jaw, a brief glance away from my gaze, her fingers tightening and loosening in anxious rhythm. The room itself seemed to pause, sensing the coming confrontation, each second suspended as the question hovered, waiting to be answered fully. I continued, detailing one more incident, the subtle remarks she made during my son's promotion dinner, the way she mocked my advice to my grandchildren, and the faint, venomous comments whispered when she assumed no one was listening. My voice remained calm, deliberate, almost gentle, but every word carried the undeniable clarity of truth. She could not ignore it. She could not dismiss it. And as I spoke, I watched the slight, almost imperceptible changes in her expression, eyes widening, lips pressing together, slight shivers that she tried to hide with careful composure. The tension she had cultivated over months now weighed heavily upon her, constricting her like a net with invisible threads. Finally, the moment had arrived. I leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on hers, and asked with deliberate clarity, the words prepared for months, "Alicia, can you tell everyone, honestly, why you've treated me this way?" The room seemed to inhale collectively, her hands twisted, her foot tapped a rapid rhythm against the floor. Daniel's eyes widened, his lips parted slightly, as though he had finally realized the full weight of what had been hidden in plain sight. My daughter's expression was calm, but tense, holding steady as she observed the unfolding drama. Even the youngest grandchildren leaned in slightly, sensing the significance, without fully understanding why.
Alicia's face went pale. Her voice trembled as she tried to speak, but only half-formed words escaped. I didn't mean," she began, but stopped abruptly, as if realizing the futility of any excuse. The room was quiet, every listener holding their collective breath, waiting for her answer. She looked at Daniel, seeking support, but his expression was conflicted, unsure whether to defend her or finally acknowledge the reality he had avoided. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. For the first time, Alicia understood that control, influence, and intimidation were no longer hers to wield. She had misjudged the strength, the patience, and the authority of the person sitting calmly across from her, prepared to expose the truth. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as she struggled internally. Each second that passed was a microcosm of the months of tension, the unspoken grievances, the subtle disrespect that had accumulated, unnoticed by others until tonight. I remained calm, poised, letting her discomfort grow without interference. Her eyes flicked to every face in the room, searching for reprieve, finding none. The carefully constructed facade she had relied upon was gone, leaving only raw exposure and growing panic. And just as the first quiver of real fear crossed her face, I knew the moment of revelation, the one question that would finally flip the entire dynamic, was upon us. Alicia's face was ghostly pale, her carefully maintained composure crumbling as her eyes darted around the room. She realized, finally, that the quiet authority I wielded wasn't a bluff. Months of dismissive remarks, subtle jabs, and condescending smiles had all led to this exact moment. The room was silent except for her shallow breaths and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Daniel sat beside her, still caught between loyalty to his wife and the undeniable truth he had been witnessing for months. My daughter's gaze was fixed on mine, a steady, reassuring presence, silently urging me forward.
I felt a surge of calm resolve. This was the moment where everything shifted, where the truth demanded to be acknowledged openly. I let the silence stretch deliberately, allowing every member of the family to feel the weight of the confrontation. Alicia fidgeted, tugging at her dress, tapping her foot nervously, twisting her fingers. She tried to form words, but the sentence broke in her throat, swallowed by the tension she had orchestrated, but now found inescapable. My son's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening as he finally processed the magnitude of what had been hidden under polite smiles and feigned ignorance. He had been shielding her, ignoring my discomfort, rationalizing her behavior as stress or fatigue. But the evidence, the carefully laid out truths, left him no room for excuses. The house, once warm and filled with casual chatter, had transformed into a stage, every family member a silent witness to the unraveling of an illusion. I spoke softly, deliberately, letting my voice flow like calm water over stones, unhurried but with precise impact. Alicia, I've noticed the patterns, the dismissals, the sarcasm, the little remarks designed to make me feel small. I've let it slide because I wanted peace. I wanted to protect my son. But I've also kept track. I have observed, patiently, because truth has a way of revealing itself. Her fingers tightened into fists now, the faint tremor in her hands betraying panic. Daniel's eyes widened, his lips parted slightly, as though he was seeing her in a way he never had before. My daughter's gaze leaned forward slightly, her expression tense yet full of support, as she witnessed what had been hidden from her. Alicia tried to speak again, attempting to dismiss or redirect, but her voice faltered. It's not like that, she whispered, the first cracks in her confidence showing. I let her words hang in the air, then gently but firmly continued. You've treated me with disrespect in front of the family repeatedly. You've mocked my choices, my efforts, and even my relationship with my son. And now here, in front of everyone, I'm asking you, why? The question was calm, but it carried months of suppressed frustration, a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. Her gaze darted to Daniel, then to the others, realizing that she could no longer manipulate perception or twist reality. The tension in her body increased visibly.
She shifted in her seat, tapping her foot nervously, her fingers twisting as she tried to think of an excuse, a justification, anything to regain control. But none came. Every attempt at humor, every deflection she had relied on in the past was useless now. The family was watching, fully aware, silently affirming the truth I had laid bare. The room seemed to contract around her, compressing the air until every breath she took felt heavier, almost impossible to ignore. I could see her pulse quicken at her neck, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, betraying the inner panic she tried desperately to hide. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but firm, carrying both concern and frustration. Alicia, do you understand what she's saying? His tone was not accusatory, but it held undeniable weight. She flinched slightly, her composure wavering further. She stammered, looking from face to face but finding no support, no way to escape. The power she had wielded for months had evaporated, replaced by vulnerability and exposure. My son, the man who had defended her so often, now realized he had been blind to her subtle cruelty. The dynamic had shifted, and for the first time he truly saw her actions through the lens I had painstakingly laid out. I continued, my voice unwavering. This isn't about anger or revenge. It's about accountability. You've shown who you are over time, and tonight the family needs to see it too. Not because I want to humiliate you, but because I will not sit silently while disrespect is hidden under polite smiles. My words flowed steadily, calm yet firm, each one a precise instrument cutting through her deflections. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Every glance she gave reflected the realization she could not talk her way out, could not charm or manipulate anyone present. The truth was undeniable, laid bare in a calm, unassailable narrative that no one could dispute. She tried again, weakly. I didn't mean it. I was only... But the words died in her throat. Her hands shook subtly, gripping her lap, nails digging into the fabric, a physical manifestation of the internal chaos she could no longer hide. Daniel placed a hand lightly over hers, not in protection, but in subtle acknowledgement of the truth he now faced. My daughter's steady gaze encouraged the room to maintain focus, silently conveying that no one would allow her manipulation to continue unchecked. Even the grandchildren, sensing the seriousness, watched quietly, their curiosity and unease amplifying the atmosphere. I allowed another deliberate pause, letting the silence press on her. Every second magnified the weight of the question I had posed, and every member of the family felt the tension like a physical presence. Alicia's attempts to regain control faltered completely. She shifted in her seat, eyes widening, lips parting, then pressing back together. The room's attention was unwavering, each face silently affirming the truth I had laid out. The subtle power she had relied on for months had slipped, and the consequences of her actions were now unavoidable. Finally, with a trembling voice, she attempted to answer, but the words were barely audible, fragmented, uncertain. I didn't realize, she whispered. The phrase hung weakly, almost ridiculous in its feebleness, unable to counter the calm, relentless clarity of truth surrounding her. My son leaned back slightly, jaw tight, eyes fixed on her. His silence now spoke volumes, acknowledging the reality he had avoided for too long. The family had witnessed enough, the subtle cruelty, the belittling, the manipulations, and the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Alicia was exposed, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through measured, deliberate truth that had been patiently accumulated and presented. I let my eyes meet hers fully, holding her gaze with quiet authority. I said softly, each word deliberate, precise. That's all I needed to hear. Finally, we see clearly, and now we can decide how to move forward. Her hands trembled visibly now, a small, unsteady gesture betraying her inner panic. Daniel's face was conflicted, caught between loyalty, realization, and disappointment. The family remained silent, letting the weight of the moment resonate. In that silence, a quiet victory had been achieved. The power had shifted, and Alicia understood fully and irrevocably that her influence had been dismantled.
The room exhaled almost imperceptibly. The tension began to release slowly, like steam escaping a pressure cooker. Alicia's shoulders slumped slightly, the rigid posture giving way to uncertainty. Every person present had seen the truth, and it was undeniable. I felt a calm resolve settle over me, a satisfaction not born of cruelty, but of justice and clarity. She had misjudged me, misjudged the family, and most of all, misjudged the quiet power of patience and truth. The confrontation, long delayed but inevitable, had finally arrived. And in that stillness, with her exposure complete, the family began to process what had unfolded, silently acknowledging the shift, the realignment, the undeniable authority that had been reclaimed. The room remained still for a long moment after Alicia's weak admission. Her shoulders slumped, her face pale, her hands resting limply in her lap. The tension that had been coiled so tightly over the past hours slowly began to release, like water leaking from a dam.
Everyone processed what had just happened, some with relief, others with quiet astonishment. Daniel's gaze softened slightly, his hands unclenching, but his eyes still held a shadow of disbelief. He had loved Alicia, defended her, rationalized her behavior, and yet, in these few moments, he had seen the truth unfold in front of him with a clarity that words could barely capture. My daughter leaned back in her chair, exhaling softly, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture of solidarity. She had been watching the entire confrontation with careful attention, weighing each detail, each expression, each falter in Alicia's carefully constructed mask. Now, she finally allowed herself a small, approving smile toward me. Nancy, sitting quietly beside me, placed a gentle hand over mine, a quiet signal that the family supported me and that the tension which had been building for months had finally been addressed. The youngest children shifted slightly, sensing the change in energy, the sudden stillness, the almost tangible release of months of suppressed unease. Alicia finally lifted her eyes to meet mine. Her gaze was unsteady, wavering between defiance, fear, and something approaching remorse. She wanted to regain control, to speak, to explain, to justify herself. But the room, the family, and the undeniable clarity of the confrontation left her with no ground. Her lips moved, forming words that never fully escaped, a faint whisper, "I didn't think." The hesitation, the incompleteness of the sentence spoke louder than any excuse could have. I maintained my calm demeanor, letting her struggle, letting the weight of her own actions settle fully on her shoulders. Daniel cleared his throat softly, breaking the tense silence. "Alicia," he said, his voice low, hesitant but firm, I think we need to understand this better. We need to figure out how to move forward without hiding from the truth anymore." His words were careful, as though balancing the fragility of his wife's shaken ego with the undeniable reality that had been exposed. Alicia nodded, almost imperceptibly, swallowing hard, realizing that the confrontation had not just revealed her behavior, but had forced her to face consequences she had never anticipated. The control she had exerted over these dinners, over the subtle family dynamics, had been dismantled in a matter of hours. I shifted slightly, letting the silence stretch again. "Moving forward," I said softly, "requires honesty. It requires acknowledging what has been done, understanding the impact, and committing to change. Without that, respect cannot exist and harmony is impossible." Alicia's fingers twitched in her lap, a small, nervous gesture that betrayed the internal reckoning now underway. The subtle, almost imperceptible shift in posture, the lowering of her shoulders, the softening of her gaze, indicated that she understood the gravity of the moment. She could no longer deflect or manipulate. The family had seen everything, and there was no turning back.
Alicia's lips trembled as she attempted to respond. I never wanted to hurt anyone," she said, her voice barely audible. It was a faint, trembling acknowledgement, unconvincing in words, yet undeniable in its admission of guilt. Her tone lacked the confidence, the arrogance, the smirk she had relied upon for months. For the first time, she seemed smaller, fragile even, as though the weight of the family's attention and the undeniable clarity of the confrontation had shifted something deep inside her. Every subtle gesture, every flicker of unease, every twitch of her hands confirmed that she could no longer rely on the defenses she had used so effortlessly before. I allowed myself a slow exhale, letting the room feel the shift in energy. Calmly, I gestured toward the table, toward the meal that had been the stage for months of subtle tension. "We can eat now," I said softly, deliberately, "if we choose to. But we must do so with awareness and with respect." Alicia's eyes flicked toward the food, a faint hesitation in her gaze. She realized that the simple act of sitting at the table now carried implications she had never anticipated. Every bite, every gesture would be observed, measured, and noted. The power she had assumed belonged entirely to her now rested in the hands of truth, calm authority, and collective witness. The family shifted slowly, quietly beginning to resume their positions around the table. Daniel offered a tentative hand toward his wife, a gesture of both support and expectation. Alicia's hand hovered briefly, uncertain, then slowly lowered onto the table, fingers trembling. My daughter smiled faintly, a quiet reassurance that the family was ready to move forward, but not without boundaries. Nancy nodded subtly, acknowledging that the confrontation had been necessary and that the shift in dynamics was now complete. The youngest children sat quietly, sensing the calm after the storm, feeling the tension ease, but remaining aware of the lessons being silently communicated through the adults' behavior. I poured myself a glass of water and set it before me, hand steady, as though the storm had passed, though the echoes lingered. Alicia's gaze remained fixed on the table, her posture now more reserved, her earlier confidence replaced by the first signs of introspection. Daniel reached for her hand again, more gently this time, as though acknowledging her vulnerability while remaining aware of the boundaries now clearly established. The room felt lighter, calmer, yet charged with a subtle undercurrent, the knowledge that respect, once neglected, had been restored, and that future interactions would carry the weight of this night. Even in the quiet aftermath, I could sense the lingering anxiety in Alicia, the faint tremor in her hands, the careful calculation of each gesture. She had learned, finally, that her control was no longer absolute, that her actions had consequences visible to all. And in that silent observation, the family had reclaimed a sense of equilibrium, one founded on truth, patience, and measured authority. The power had shifted, subtle but undeniable, and every member of the household was aware.
Alicia sat quietly at the table, her hands folded nervously, eyes fixed on the pattern of the tablecloth as though it could anchor her thoughts. The shift in the room was palpable. The subtle authority she had wielded for months had vanished, leaving her exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. Every glance from my children, every measured expression from Daniel, reinforced that the balance had changed. She no longer held control, no longer set the tone. The silence that had once made her confident now pressed down on her, heavy and undeniable. Daniel reached across the table tentatively, placing his hand lightly over hers. "We need to acknowledge this," he said softly, the words careful but firm. "Not to punish, but to understand, to make sure this doesn't happen again." Alicia's eyes flicked up to him, a mixture of fear, shame, and relief passing through her gaze. For the first time, she realized that honesty, not manipulation, was the path forward. She tried to find words, but the right ones wouldn't come, and the silence became a mirror, reflecting every subtle action and comment she had made over the months. I watched her closely, maintaining a calm presence, letting the weight of the moment settle without pushing, without raising my voice. "We've been patient. We've endured the small jabs, the subtle disrespect, the dismissive remarks. But tonight, the truth has been laid bare. And now the choice is yours, to acknowledge it or to continue pretending." Her fingers twitched, betraying the inner conflict raging beneath the surface. She had always believed she could navigate any situation with charm or subtle deflection, but she had underestimated the quiet power of observation and the patience that accompanies it. Alicia's eyes wandered around the room, meeting the steady gazes of my children. My daughter's expression was calm, supportive yet unyielding, silently communicating that respect was not optional. My son's eyes reflected a complex mixture of disappointment and love, a realization that loyalty could not excuse disrespect and that protection could not substitute for accountability. Even the youngest children, sensing the shift in energy, watched quietly, absorbing the gravity of what had unfolded. The weight of truth filled the room, settling over each person like a gentle but firm presence, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Finally, Alicia exhaled sharply, a long, trembling breath that seemed to release some of the tension coiled within her. I see it now, she said softly, her voice quivering but sincere. I didn't realize how my actions came across, how my words hurt. Her admission hung in the air, fragile yet undeniable. Daniel's hand squeezed hers lightly, an acknowledgement of both her recognition and the work that lay ahead. She had finally begun to understand that her perceived control had been an illusion, and that the respect she had tried to evade would not be granted without effort and honesty. I nodded slowly, allowing the silence to stretch, giving space for the weight of her words to settle fully. Acknowledgement is the first step, but it must be followed by consistent action. Respect is earned, not assumed. Every choice moving forward matters. Every word carries weight. This isn't about punishment. It's about understanding, accountability, and rebuilding. Alicia's gaze dropped again, fingers interlacing nervously, the tremor in her hand slowly subsiding as she absorbed the lesson she had been forced to confront. The room, once charged with tension, now hummed with quiet reflection, each person considering what the confrontation had revealed about themselves, about boundaries, and about family. Daniel exhaled, a soft release of breath, and looked toward me. "Thank you," he said quietly, not for confrontation, but for clarity. The calm authority I had displayed had allowed the family to witness a truth they had suspected but had never confronted fully. The children's quiet nods reinforced the shared understanding. The family dynamic had shifted, but not destroyed.
Boundaries had been clarified, respect had been reclaimed, and the space for honest communication had been opened. Alicia's eyes rose finally, meeting mine directly. There was vulnerability there, an unspoken apology, a recognition of the power she had underestimated. I offered a faint, calm smile, not a smile of triumph, but of understanding. The confrontation was not about winning or losing. It was about truth, patience, and the restoration of balance. The room exhaled collectively, tension giving way to a cautious sense of resolution. Each person, in their own way, began to adjust to the new equilibrium. Even in the quiet aftermath, the lesson lingered. Alicia would carry the weight of the moment with her, a reminder that respect must be given and received consciously. Daniel would remember that loyalty does not excuse blindness. My children would see that patience and observation can yield justice without anger. And I, sitting calmly at the table, felt the quiet satisfaction of having preserved dignity while restoring balance, knowing that the question I had asked had done more than expose disrespect. It had illuminated truth, reshaped understanding, and created space for a more honest future. The room had finally settled into a fragile calm, the storm of confrontation fading into an uneasy but honest peace. Alicia's shoulders were no longer rigid, though a subtle tension lingered, a reminder that the moment of truth could not be undone. She sat quietly, head bowed slightly, as though the weight of her actions had finally pressed down enough to force reflection. Daniel reached for her hand once more, this time not in defense, but in gentle acknowledgement, a gesture that carried both hope and expectation.
The rest of the family exhaled slowly, allowing themselves to absorb the shift that had taken place. I observed her closely, letting my calm presence communicate what words alone could not. Alicia, you now know how your actions affected everyone here. The insults, the smirks, the subtle disregard, it all mattered. But there is one question left, one simple question that clarifies everything. Her head lifted slightly, curiosity mingling with fear in her eyes. Daniel stiffened beside her, sensing the weight of what I was about to say. The family leaned in slightly, drawn into the quiet gravity of the moment. I took a deep breath, letting the words hang in the air, each syllable deliberate, precise, and impossible to ignore. Do you respect this family? The question, simple in structure, carried layers of consequence. It was not rhetorical. It demanded honesty, demanded acknowledgement, demanded a shift in perception. Alicia's hands trembled, fingers twisting nervously. Her eyes darted to Daniel, then to my children, then back to me. The silence pressed down on her like a tangible weight. She realized fully and irrevocably that this question could not be deflected or dismissed. Her lips parted and a faint, shaky voice emerged. I do, she whispered. The words were tentative, almost fragile, but they were spoken. Her hands unclenched slightly, and the tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. The room remained quiet, letting the significance of the admission resonate. This was the moment where power shifted completely. No longer could she manipulate. No longer could she belittle. No longer could she evade responsibility. Her acknowledgement, though small, marked a turning point, a recognition of truth, a beginning of respect, a path toward rebuilding trust. Daniel exhaled, a soft, relieved sound, and offered a faint nod toward me. The subtle gesture spoke volumes. The balance had been restored. My children relaxed slightly, a sense of quiet satisfaction passing among them. Even the youngest grandchildren, sensing the change, adjusted in their seats, absorbing the calm that replaced tension. Alicia's gaze lowered again, a flicker of humility in her expression. She had faced the consequences of her actions and realized for the first time that respect and authority were not something to challenge lightly. I allowed a small, calm smile to touch my lips, not of triumph, but of resolution. The question had done more than expose disrespect. It had illuminated character, clarified boundaries, and shifted the energy of the room entirely. Alicia's trembling hands rested on the table, a subtle acknowledgement of the lesson she would carry forward. Daniel squeezed her hand gently, signaling support while simultaneously communicating that change and awareness were now essential. The family, quietly observing, felt the restored balance, the subtle power of truth, patience, and deliberate action.
In that moment, I understood the final truth of the evening. It had never been about humiliation or victory. It had been about clarity, about the power of asking the right question at the right moment, about the strength of calm authority and the quiet patience to wait for a reckoning. Alicia had been exposed, yes, but she had also been given the opportunity to rebuild, to acknowledge, to adjust. And the family, collectively, had reclaimed the respect, boundaries, and equilibrium that had been quietly undermined for far too long. As the room slowly returned to ordinary rhythm, the tension lingering only as a faint memory, I realized that the one question, simple, unassuming, yet devastating in its precision, had done what months of silent endurance could not. Alicia's acknowledgement was not just a word, it was the turning point, the twist,
the quiet victory that restored balance and redefined the family dynamic forever. And in that calm, deliberate silence, I finally allowed myself to exhale fully, knowing that truth, patience, and courage had prevailed.